welcome once again to Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. We're here today to talk about the work of the theater artist Vinnette Carroll. Now, Vinnette Carroll was not a Philadelphian. This is not a Philadelphia story. But in terms of the Tryout Town Season 3, of which this is the penultimate episode, we are going to talk about some of the amazing work done by African-American theater artists as tryout productions in the commercial theaters of Philadelphia during the 1970s. And here today, to share it with us, is one of the friends of our podcast, Jerrell Henderson. Jerrell Henderson, of course, is a Philadelphia-born actor and director, and he is currently the curator of the Black Theater Vinyl Archive on Instagram. I spoke to him recently over Zoom from his home in Chicago, Illinois. Here is our conversation. Jerrell, welcome again to Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me back. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. Well, it's wonderful to see your face. Here you are back with us, and you're here to talk to us about this very, very important but underserved in terms of her historical impact, the great director and writer and actress Vinnette Carroll. So I posted a few times, every day I post something about Philadelphia theater history, things that I come across, mostly in the archives. And when I would post things about Vinnette Carroll, I would almost inevitably get a response back from you. And you'd say, I want to talk so much about her, and I think she's underappreciated. What was your initial introduction to the work of Vinnette Carroll? Why are you so excited about her, interested in her?
I learned about her work once I started doing further deep dives into Black theater, which happened when I was in undergrad. So it was in the early 2000s. It's actually in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I knew I loved musical theater, but I also knew that there were a lot of shows. I knew that my education was limited, and there were a lot of shows that I had heard of, but had never listened to. And of course, I was a theater high school person, as a Walnut Street Theater adopted kid in my senior year at GAMP, very South Philadelphia upbringing. And so when I started to learn more about these musicals, I, of course, migrated towards Black musicals because I am African American, but also because my parents were very pro-Black. I call them Black nationalists, even though they do not, well, one's passed. They never identified themselves as Black nationalists. It's just how they behaved.
Right, it was the sea they were swimming in. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so when I started to find the musicals of the 1970s, right? So I found my way first to Sophisticated Ladies, which is an 80s musical with Gregory Hines. Through Gregory Hines, I find Eubie, which is late 1970s. Eubie then leads to Ain't Misbehaving, you know what I mean? I already knew about The Wiz. But then I started to hear about this musical called Your Arms Too Short to Box with God. Growing up in the Black church, I know that phrase. You hear that title and you know it, you recognize it, you know what the show's going to be about. And so when I heard the title, Your Arms Too Short to Box with God, I'm like, what is this about? Wait a minute. It's another play about the gospel of Jesus Christ, because, of course, in the 1970s, you also have Godspell, which I was a huge fan of. I still am. And Jesus Christ Superstar. And of course, growing up in the Black church, I'm very familiar with these stories. Right. So anyway, that was my first kind of how I was introduced to her. And then the other play, a musical I heard about was Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope. And I always used to get that confused with Stop the World, I Want to Get Off. These are shows that, again, I had never listened to. Right. But the title of the show made me love it.
Right. From the very late 60s, early 70s, there were a lot of shows with very cutesy titles. I mean, there was if even the Black theater, was that Sweetback's Badass?
Yeah, the
Melvin Ben Peebles,
right? Badass song. Well, you have his musical. His musical was called Ain't Supposed to Die a Natural Death.
Right, another title like that.
And then, of course, once I became more familiar with the work of Mickey Grant, I would become even more familiar with Vinnette Carroll. So that happens in undergrad, and I kind of listen to these, and it's fine. But I'm also learning about Fiddler on the Roof, and I'm also learning about Mac and Mabel, all these other plays. And of course, there are more shows that are predominantly white than were
Sure.
African American, especially the ones that were actually recorded. And that's a whole other
Right.
conversation. One of the reasons why I do Black Theater Vinyl podcast, because it's like y'all need to be recording these.
Right.
But at any rate, when I learned about Mickey Grant through Working, the
Hmm.
musical Working, and the two songs that she composed for Working,
Right. The Studs
both
Terkel
sung by,
musical.
that's
Yeah.
absolutely right,
Right.
sung
Which
by
was
the
by a
great
variety of musicians, but she
yeah,
contributed a couple
James
songs. Right.
Taylor, a bunch of people. And I started really getting into Mickey Grant. And the more I got into Mickey Grant, the more I'm like, wait a minute, what she was doing with Vinnette Carroll, wait a minute. No one else did that. I'm reading information and I'm like, this is literally my journey with Vinnette Carroll and Mickey Grant. Of
Right.
being like, I had no awareness of them. And then I become a little bit aware of them and it piques my curiosity until you're finally like, wait a minute, didn't they invent a whole style of American musical? Wait a minute.
They did. They seem to
They
have.
and I'm a fan of Langston Hughes. I'm a diehard fan of Langston Hughes. So he wasn't perfect in his relations, but he did. You can tell in his work that he loved Black people. When you read the simple stories,
Mhm.
when you read his plays, you can tell in his writing he
Right.
really loved exploring Black people, and he loved Black, not just Black high art, but also
Hmm.
Black folk art, and
Right.
sometimes dirty stories and blues
Yeah.
songs.
But
And
then in the early
so,
1960s, he gets into gospel music. And Langston Hughes
well,
wasn't a
that's
person who was really a part of the church. And suddenly he's writing shows which feature the rituals of the Black church in them.
but
And everybody knows. When I first started looking at Philadelphia theater, I everybody kept talking about all these great productions of Black Nativity that the Freedom Theater in Philadelphia used to do
absolutely.
either at the Arts Bank or up at their theater on North Broad Street, and that was an annual event. And I remember when I was in Minnesota, the Penumbra Theater did an annual production of Black Nativity. It's like for a Black theater company, Black Nativity is like Christmas Carol. It's the show you
That
trot
is
out
correct.
at the
That is
holidays,
correct.
which brings in a big box office and possibly funds the rest of your year. But it allows you to integrate a lot of children and young people into the production, so it really gets you involved with community. So it's been a constant presence in many late 20th, early 21st century Black American theaters. And it says by Langston Hughes. Now, every theater company sort of loosely adapts it from that basis. And it says in the script, you can adapt this as you need. But nowhere have I ever heard the name Vinnette Carroll associated with it until I started looking into this topic. And it turns out
That's right.
that Vinnette Carroll was the original director and creator of the show. And actually, Langston Hughes sort of gave her free reign, said, here's the material. I wrote these poems. You put them together, Vinnette.
Well, according to the dissertation
Yeah,
I was reading that you sent me,
right,
he got the idea from watching something that she created. So she had
right,
created a piece of art,
right.
and he watched it and was like, "Oh, wait a minute, that's kind of like what I like to do. Oh, you know what? I
She
can
was
do this
doing a
other
show
thing."
in 1957 at the Equity Library Theater. James Earl Jones and Roscoe Lee Brown and Cicely Tyson were all in this
Hmm.
production of a show that had been done many times, and it was basically about a ghost boy who falls in love with a human girl. It's the story of Barbara Allen, but it was usually done with sort of Appalachian or country music. And she said, "Well, we ought to do it in a Black context, and we'll use Black actors, and we'll use music from the Black theater." I should mention, by the way, that the dissertation that Jerrell is mentioning is one that is by Calvin A. McClinton. He wrote it in 1997 for his PhD dissertation, which was awarded by Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, and was subsequently published. Although it's very hard to find it's long out of print. So I was able to dig into the digital archives and find the dissertation, and I shared it with Jerrell so we could, bone up on this topic. And he mentions that they were doing this production. It was one of the first plays she ever directed at the Equity Library stage is a famous place for people to get started. It's a tiny, tiny space. I guess Langston Hughes saw it and said, "Hey, I've got this idea for you." So
Yeah.
why don't we know more about Vinnette Carroll involvement with this iconic African American play?
The short answer to that question is really simple. The longer answer is, of course, more complicated and nuanced. But the short answer is she's Black and she's a woman.
Okay.
It was harder for Black people, and it is harder for Black people in general, and it is harder for women in general. But when you are a Black woman or a woman of color, then you kind of have this double whammy that, again, as she said often throughout her career, it's not impossible.
Well, there is a story at the beginning of this document that we're talking about where she told a story about herself that someone earlier in her career said, "Well, you've got so much talent, but you have to take away a third for being Black, and you have to take away a
Yeah,
third for being a
and the
woman." She
third for
says,
being a woman.
and she
And
said, "I'm going to do a lot with that
I
one
would do a
third."
lot with that last third. Exactly. Honestly, that's the kind of the fact that we know who she is because of two things. One, she was dogged in her belief that she
Hmm.
had something to offer and
Hmm.
that she was going to keep putting things, whether it was on Broadway or not,
Hmm.
she was going to keep creating. And two, as time has gone on, more people like myself and you have studied and looked into this, who are like, wait a minute, the more we learn, the more we look back to uncover what was lost. It's like Hidden Figures. I
Right.
watched Hidden Figures, the film, and I left and I was really happy, but I was also really angry. And I was with my husband, Ricky, and he's like, why are you angry? It was a beautiful movie. And I'm like, I'm angry because I'm in my 30s and I never knew about that.
Right.
I would have thought about myself differently.
Mm.
You know what I mean? It's
Right.
like when you watch Summer of Soul. I watch Summer of Soul, the Questlove documentary, and I cry every time because the era that I grew up in wasn't that far removed from the time period in which that concert took place. And I grew up my entire life never having seen any documentation of a large scale concert taking place in a primarily Black community that is being attended by
Hmm.
mostly African Americans, and it was all peaceful and all good.
Right.
But I knew
So,
about the moon landing
yeah.
and I knew about Woodstock, and both of those things happened at the same time. So
Right.
it's kind of the similar thing with Vinnette Carroll.
Right.
I think,
Well, can you give us a brief overview for our listeners of her life story? I would especially love to hear about her upbringing, her education in theater, and her early work as a director. What can you tell us about her, Vinnette Carroll?
Well, I'll tell you what I know, but I know you'll keep me honest.
I will, because I've
so
been
for
reading all this stuff too. We've both done our homework, so we'll keep each other
for,
honest.
for what I know, so Vinnette Carroll, I believe she was born in the States. I know she grew up in Jamaica, but
She's
she
born in New
wasn't
York.
born
Yeah,
there. She's
yeah.
born in New York, to middle class families. And this is important. It's similar to Lorraine Hansberry. It's really, really important to note that her parents were educated middle class Black people
Right,
towards the beginning of the 20th century,
right.
because everything that she did in her life, in a way, was pushed forward by that. So she's moved to Jamaica with her sister to live with their maternal
Well, yeah,
grandmother, I
her
believe.
parents were Jamaican and had immigrated from Jamaica, but
Yeah,
they were even in Jamaica. They were from an upper middle class and a highly
exactly.
educated
I was, I
professional
was,
elite. Yeah,
I was absolutely. We're on the
right,
same page.
right.
They moved to Jamaica because her dad's going to become a dentist, and they don't have enough time. Like, for anyone who's ever been in graduate school, it's really hard to raise children while you're also studying for a profession. And so, the fact that they were in Jamaica with their maternal grandmom, it's like, yeah, but their dad was in school learning how to be a dentist, which at that time was a really, really upscale career for an African American man. But having said that, as you just pointed out, even when they were in Jamaica, they were like middle class, possibly even upper middle class in Jamaica. So they were still getting really great education. Her grandmother was making sure that they were going to art museums and going to see theater. And if I'm not mistaken, even went to see like the royal family when the royal family came on the tour. So
Probably.
she was surrounded by elder Black people who believed that a child not only was like math and science is important, but arts and literature were
Hmm.
essential to you being a full, well rounded adult.
Right.
And so that's the kind, so she grows up in this environment where it's like, no, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be some kind of academic or professional, you're going to have some kind of job that takes that approach. Okay. She moves back to New York with her parents and grows up, and her parents are like, you're going to be some kind of doctor. However, particularly her mom makes sure that, again, they go see theater, they go see art, they go see dance. She decides mostly to appease her father because her father was a tough nut to
He seemed
crack.
to be quite an authoritarian man,
When I read,
very demanding.
she
Yeah,
referred to him as authoritarian, and she referred to him as a dictator.
right.
So, and I know people like that. I have relatives that were like that who grew up in the beginning, towards the beginning of the 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no compromise on Black respectability, how you present yourself, how, because I mean, I get it. You know how the world sees you. Like, I've been poor and Black. I know how people get treated when they don't think you have value. She's going to go into psychology. She starts to study psychology, but as she's studying psychology,
She gets her
um,
master's degree
she
at
gets her
Columbia.
master's.
Right.
Yeah,
And then she's going
well,
on for a
she
PhD.
she
Yeah.
was going for a PhD and then she drops out at the last minute. So she almost achieves this doctorate. And then she's like, I don't want to do this. I
Right.
don't want to do this. And while her parents have also raised her to be like professional, respectable, they've also raised her to be driven by the arts and to be outspoken and have her own mind. And so this is when the beauty of like that only in America in the 20th century could you have a personality like this,
Mm-hmm.
of this Black woman who has a sense of herself. And she says many, many times in interviews, I never saw myself as less than. I never saw myself as needing to make up anything. So in her mind, it was the best decision she had to make for her. So she goes into the art, she begins studying, and she finds her way in with Erwin Piscator,
Yeah, she goes to the new school and
the
studies
new
with
school.
Piscator. Yeah, which
Oh,
is
is it
amazing.
Piscator?
Well, I think I've heard it pronounced both ways. We'll go for
Okay.
Piscator. Well, it's
Piscator.
complicated.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
I think it is in Germany. But who is this big deal?
This is a huge deal. I only know him by name
Right.
because I've watched Elaine Stritch's Live at Liberty, her one woman show,
Sure.
so many times. I love
Right.
it. And she talks about studying with him.
Right.
And so I'm like, oh, I've heard of this guy. And you
Right.
look him up and you're like, oh, right, I learned about him in like
He's
directing and
working with
acting.
Bertolt Brecht in the late
Yeah.
1920s. He comes to he
It was
goes to
a
first the Soviet
huge
Union
deal.
and then to America when the Nazis. Right. He works, by the way, at the Hedgerow Theater, doing his version
Shut
of
up.
yes, he does. He directs a show at the Hedgerow Theater, and then but opens with this beginning of serious study of acting. He's one of the first. The new school is one of the first places where they really set up an acting program, and he's running it. It's a little disparate because he's bringing in Lee Strasberg as well to teach acting classes, which
I
is a
know, isn't
whole
that
different
funny?
type of
Yeah.
theater than he was doing. I mean, Lee Strasberg is doing this highly psychological Stanislavski and stuff,
Right.
but Piscator and his like are doing what he would consciously call epic theater. He's doing shows that have a political point of view, that are about the ensemble, that are not about psychological reality, but are about social and political realities. They're about, he's
Absolutely.
not using the standard plot lines and realistic presentation. He's using montage. He's using ensemble creativity, no star system. And this is where Vinnette Carroll studies. And she works on, and you can see that even in school, she was given roles like Clytemnestra. And he gives her,
Absolutely.
he is so impressed with her. He gives her a full scholarship. You know?
He,
Yeah.
I'm looking for my Piscator, man.
Yeah.
I'm looking for the person who's like, oh my God, you have so much to offer. Let me
Right.
give you all of these resources.
Right.
And just help support you. And you're a Black woman, and I don't care about that. I just think you're good. It's the best of that kind of like, you just bring in the best person for the
Right.
role, and you just don't care about it. It's the best version of that.
Yeah.
We know that there's another side. But
Right.
anyway, so she's studying with Piscator, but as she's studying with him, you can't run away from who you are and how you grew up. There's a Bible verse. I was just joking with my mom because I watched the book of Clarence the other day. And I remembered all the Bible stories because I don't go to church anymore. And I'm like, train up a child in the way he should grow. And when he is old, he will not depart from it. And she goes, you remember that Bible verse? I'm like, as much as you told me, as much as y'all said it when we grew up. Yes,
Right.
I still remember it. But I say that to say that it's similar with Vinnette Carroll. Like,
Mm-hmm.
even though she's being influenced by these European influences, as it's beginning to settle inside of her and inside of her body and her spirit, she's like, "This is cool. How can I do this for me? How
and
can
for
I
my
make this
community and for
closer
my
to
people.
who,
Yeah,
yeah, to who I am as a
right.
Black woman, as an aware Black woman, as a Black woman who appreciates history and myth, as a, you know what I mean? Like, as a
Yeah.
Black woman who's got something to say politically. So it's really fascinating to see how all of these kind of threads would lead into the tapestry of the career that she was able to
So what does
lead.
she do with her career at first when she gets out of this training program? What does she
She
do?
is an actor and she works, she's fairly successful. She's oh, I can't remember what, oh, you know what was she works and has some success on and off Broadway regionally, but not a lot. And she begins to run up against the reality of what it means to be a Black woman in American theater. And
Right.
it's hard now.
Yeah.
So you can, that gives you some clue as to how hard it was. What is this, like 60 years ago?
Yeah. Well, to the early
And like
1950s, she gets cast
just
in Antony and Cleopatra in a production, an off-Broadway production, and she gets cast as
she's
Fatata Tita, which is
she's
everyone's favorite
only
role. Right.
playing maids.
Right.
She's only playing maids and service people, and that's the reality.
Right.
That is the reality. To an extent, it doesn't matter how well trained you are. It doesn't matter who you work with, because if you're working in America,
Yeah.
you playing somebody's servant, and she's like, I mean, it's cool and all.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a small role, and every role can have dignity to it.
Right.
Having said that, I know I can do more than play somebody's servant. So she begins to do like a one woman show where she
Right.
tours to colleges
Right.
and she's performing poetry, Peter.
Yes.
She's performing poetry and monologue. She becomes a monologuist. She's
So
doing
she
poetry.
has a
And
one-woman
so
show.
that's what she
Right.
begins to do.
Right.
However, the more she acts, the more and the more she works with people, the more she realizes that she's more of a director and a show creator
Mm-hmm.
than she is a performer. And she's also, the reason why I became a director, you just have more agency as a director than you do as a performer.
Right.
Now, once you start working as a director, you realize that the agency you thought you had
Right.
it's as much as you thought it was.
Right.
But when you are working, you have more agency than when you were a
Right.
performer.
So she helps to
Yeah.
create this play. We talked about how she started working at the Equity Library Theater, and then
Yep.
she starts working on this Langston Hughes project, which becomes Black Nativity. Now, originally, it wasn't going to be called Black Nativity.
No, it's like, wasn't that a great day, or isn't
Right.
it a great day?
Right.
Something like that.
Again, it's a spiritual title, and there's a long history of plays at this point that include spirituals in them. That almost every scene that has a Black character will somehow migrate to a Black church, and you'll have a
Don't get
spiritual
me
song.
started.
I know. It's another program.
Every
Yeah.
Black person in
Right.
plays before 1964,
Mhm.
they know the Bible so well, they
Yeah.
can quote scripture at the
Well, you
drop of
just
the
did.
hat.
Okay.
That's also true.
Yeah. Um,
but yeah, so she
yeah,
starts,
she's
yeah.
doing this show, and she really begins to discover gospel music. Now, not just spirituals, not just the deeper history of spirituals from the late 19th, early 20th century, which tend to be, laments or meditative. This is high-powered, high-energy, celebratory and ritual music that had always been part of the Black church. Now, interestingly, not part of her background, right? She didn't grow up with this. She grew up in the staid Anglican, type of
Yeah.
church, which was very, bring out your hymn books, everybody. We're gonna
That's
sing
right.
Mighty Fortress is Our God, and
Very civilized.
very civilized
Is the word
right?
they used to use.
Yeah. So this wasn't her. I mean, not every, as you say, not every Black person that comes. There's a wide variety of influences and milieus that people come out of. But when she does discover it, she says, "This is a great place to go. This is where I can make a kind of statement." Yeah. So then by the mid 1960s, there's now a new context for a lot of American theater makers as the for-profit commercial theater is beginning to wake up to some African American theater makers and wake up to a lot of rock and roll music and gospel music and things that are a different idiom. There's also these huge sources of funding coming in. So last time we talked together, we were talking about the brief period of the WPA Theater Project when there was federal funding for the arts. for about 3.5 years during the Great Depression. And then that was suddenly Congress, it was a conservative movement in Congress, and that all got pulled. But we're now in the mid 1960s when we're not 1965. Adam Clayton Powell gets helps to found the National Endowment for the Arts and things, and the Ford Foundation is pouring huge amounts of money on the Rockefeller Foundation, and there's all sorts of ideas that arts funding can do social good, can do political good, and a lot of that begins to be directly funded towards urban communities. So how does that affect where Vinnette Carroll goes next?
Well, in the process of creating shows and directing, as she begins to do that more, she also realizes that there's no training ground for a Black aesthetic. Now you have to remember, Negro Ensemble Company, the Lafayette
Mm-hmm.
Players, the Black theater movement has not happened yet,
Right,
because that's late 60s going into early 70s,
right.
right? Because
It's not far
Douglas
away, but
Stern,
it hasn't happened
it's
yet.
not far away, but it hasn't happened. Douglas Stern
Yeah,
Award hasn't written that article that's going to be picked up by the New York Times
right,
of like, yo, what about Black theater?
right.
So she's like, so what am I? So she's looking at how she learned theater. She's looking at the way that theater is taught, and she's understanding what she wants to do, and realizing that there's no path from how she learned to create art to the art that she wants to create. There's no direct path that way. There has to be a lot more translation. And so she begins to create urban arts. I forget the exact year.
Well, yeah, I think like
Um,
1966, 65.
yeah,
Yeah,
she
she's
moves
getting
to create,
funding. Right.
yeah, to create urban arts because this is going to be a training ground for Black actors or
Mm-hmm.
actors in the African American aesthetic in the
Mm-hmm.
diaspora who can begin to learn how to okay, traditional training programs live in the world of Aristotle and Stanislavski.
Okay.
Vinnette Carroll comes from an older theatrical place that begins with storytelling, communal choral storytelling. It is closer to the way that it was before Aristotle came on, before they came on the scene, and before Western civilization was like, this is the only way to do theater. You also have to remember that we're at the end of the golden age of American musicals at this
Right.
point,
Right.
right? Hallelujah Baby is one of the last ones. We haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah.
So we're still in Man of La Mancha.
Right.
People are like,
Well,
this
there had
style's
been,
not going
I'm
anywhere.
thinking about, I
But
just
that's all
talked to,
realism. That's all
right.
realism and
Right.
naturalism. And she's like, that's not how I want to tell stories.
Right. So shows like Music Man and Guys and Dolls and even How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying are white musicals which have gospel numbers in them, right?
Don't get me started.
No,
Don't get me
so
started.
it's
Yeah,
not
they
right,
do.
right. But it's taken out of the black context, right? Brotherhood of Man
Absolutely.
and You Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat. When they eventually
Amazing
yeah,
song.
right, right. But now she is thinking that she's going to work with young people, and specifically, she's trying to bring young people into a train.
That's
She
right.
had taught for a long time at the High School for Performing
High School for
Arts,
Creative and Performing Arts.
right?
That's
But she left
absolutely
it
right.
to start her directing career. But she still wants to work with young people, so she's bringing them in to sort of create a training program and to create an ensemble for the work she wants to do. And who walks into the room one day when she's looking to do something? We've mentioned her name already, but let's bring her back into the room. A young
So
actress, right?
Mickey Grant, whose career it's I okay. Mickey Grant works with Langston Hughes in Jericho Jim Crow
Mm-hmm.
in the 60s. She, around the same time, I forget the exact timeline of it, she also runs into Vinnette Carroll, and they have similar aesthetics. And I think it was something like once they heard Mickey Grant sing, I've got no time for hating, no time. The river rolls, and so does time. Loving comes easy once you start, but hating just takes too much heart. The river's rolling, and there's so little time. You've been in rooms, creative rooms where like
Right.
people are trying to figure things out and then somebody does something and it becomes really obvious that that person needs to be the one doing that.
Right.
So Mickey Grant sings and she writes her own music. And so Vinnette Carroll is like, whoa, here's somebody I can create and build stories with. Because it's important that the work has a musical sense to it. Rhythm is really important to it. Mickey Grant is writes in the vein of a folk artist,
Right. Which was very popular at the time.
like a
That was the
Dylan,
milieu.
a
Yeah.
Dylan, Joan Baez.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? And so yeah, Mickey Grant comes on the scene, and once Mickey Grant and Vinnette Carroll come together, it's magic.
So this show that they end up creating, Don't Bother Me, I Can't
I
Cope.
can't cope. Right,
Right.
71, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, they begin working on it in their loft space in Chelsea, I believe it is, and are creating it with this young, a dynamic cast of people, and they're showing it at various small theaters and venues in New York. But they begin to get the interest of commercial producers. And
Hmm.
one of the first places they bring it is to the Walnut Street Theater in Philadelphia in October of 1971. I knew we'd get back to Philadelphia. So the Walnut
Doesn't
Street
everything
Theater,
come back to
right, it
Philadelphia?
does. Well, I wish it was true, but for the purpose of this podcast, yes. So the Walnut had been had closed, interestingly, with a show, Big Time Buck White, which was another black show, was the last show.
Is that the Muhammad Ali one?
Well, he wasn't in it at the Walnut, although he did come to the Walnut to see it. It's a chapter in my upcoming book, Jerrell. You can read all about it. All right.
Okay.
But so then the Walnut, the Schuberts sold the theater, and they had to get rid of it, and it became a nonprofit corporation. And then for over a year, it was completely renovated. They ripped out all the renovations that had done by the Schuberts in 1920. It was far from being the 19th century theater it once had been, but they ripped out more stuff in 1970. And by the fall of 1971, it was ready to go again. It was part of a big nonprofit. And interestingly, the very first thing, this will interest you, the very first thing that happened there was Lillian Gish came to town and showed some clips of her movies, like Birth of a Nation.
Yay!
Well, which everyone's interested in. So she's showing stuff that she did with D.W. Griffith, and she had a sort of a talk thing there. And then the next thing that comes, so that was the grand opening. The next thing that comes in is this production of Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope.
They were really looking to run the gamut of interest at that time, I suppose. Incredibly racist material, and then Black progressive material. There you go.
Right. They had very eclectic programming.
Yeah, exactly.
But
thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
And the reviews, which I've shared with you, were mixed. Jonathan Tarkiff, who was the reviewer for the Daily News, he didn't care for it really at all. He says it teeters on the edge between poignancy and appeasement. Then the show's Oscar Brown Jr.-ish title song is premised with Black concerns. It soon broadens out to include a catch-all of universal topical uncopables. The Price Freeze, Ralph Nader, Shirley Chisholm, and Bella Abzug. So it had this opening number, which was about the sort of psychological trouble that Black people have living in society. And, this Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope is what they're saying to their psychiatrist, right? Although at one and had a lot of topical references. Interestingly, apparently, Richard Nixon uses the phrase in the show to Shirley Chisholm. I mean, so if the early 1970s, those have been big names. I mean, it wouldn't play so well now, right? But it had a lot of gospel numbers in it too.
That's right.
Which leads me now. So I'm gonna see if I can play in a little bit more of some of the music from the show. So here's a moment that I picked out from early in the musical Fighting for Pharaoh, sung by Alex Bradford and Bobby Hall and Charles Campbell.
Now history's pages say man through the ages has never run short of a war, for he's always found something worth fighting and killing and dying for. Well, we've been fighting for Pharaoh, fighting for Caesar, fighting for good King Arthur, dying for freedom, dying for slavery, dying for cotton and oil and gold, dying.
So there's a political message. Yeah, it's not a scripted show. It sort of goes from one number to the other. It has sort of in 30 years before they would have called it a review. In fact, many the reviewers do call it specifically a review and sort of downplay it a little bit, but it does well, and then it gets picked up by a Philadelphia producer, Mo Septi. Now, Mo Septi was at that point had just taken over management of the Locust Theater, which it's over by the Academy of Music, but it's an older place now, but it becomes a venue where a lot of Black plays get done. And Mo Septi picks it up, and now they're revising it. They're working on it. It's getting essentially the out-of-town tryout treatment, and they bring it back to the new Locust Theater, where they develop it again more for a few more weeks, and then I think it goes to some other cities as well. I mean, Philadelphia isn't the only place this show is developed. We shouldn't advocate too much for the city's significance of the story, but it eventually goes on to Broadway and becomes a huge hit. Runs for years, right? And has all sorts of touring companies. So really makes Vinnette Carroll's and Mickey Grant's reputation. So, which leads her then to go on and do other things. What other shows do we move on to from there in terms of what Vinnette Carroll's and Mickey Grant's collaboration?
The next major show that they work on is the gospel play "Your Arms Too Short to Box with God."
Right. But before that,
did I forget?
Here, I'm keeping you honest, as I promised to do.
Yeah.
Right. Before that, Mickey Grant works on a play that she develops. Again, Mo Septi brings her down to the new Locust Theater, and she works on two one-act plays. One of them is based upon this project that Vinnette Carroll had always wanted to do, which was a play about Vietnam War soldiers rising up from their graves and speaking their truth, refusing to lie down in their graves. And this is called Step Lively Boy, against another one of those sort of titles,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes,
and
I forget. Yes.
Right. And that's paired with a music called Aha, or Croesus and the Witch, which is based upon the ancient Greek myth of Croesus. And it stars a young Sherman Hemsley.
Yes.
Who is, again, a Philadelphia actor who had, by this point, had started in Philadelphia theater, but had now moved on to New York and was beginning to develop a big career, was eventually in Purlie Victorious, right?
Purlie the Musical.
Purlie the Musical.
There's more than one way. Trapping a possum, hooking a catfish, picking a blossom, just like there's a lot of ways of wearing a hat. There's more than one way of getting a cat. Hey!
So they're working together at the new Locust Theater, and that neither of those shows become a big hit. Right.
By the way, my for years, my dad loved the fact that he didn't know personally, but would see Sherman Hemsley around when he was still a mailman.
Oh,
and so
right.
he would always be like, I used to see him delivering mail. He was a mailman, and now he's a
I was just asking if...
And that goes for you too. Once and for all, will you be quiet and let me talk?
Okay, I'll be quiet. But this better be good.
Look, I love you, Louise. Hear that? I love you. And what's more,
Oh, George.
there goes that big mouth again.
Yeah. Sherman Hemsley, man. Yeah, one of the greats.
But then they move on to go back to the gospel tradition. And as you mentioned, this was a time when biblically based musicals were huge. Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell were all over the place, and they decided to do a one based on the traditions of the Black church. So Your Arms Are Too Short to Box with God. Isn't that a poem by...
Young man, your arms too short to box with God is the first line of the Prodigal Son sermon, which is taken from James Weldon Johnson's God's Trombones.
Okay.
So when you get to Your Arms Too Short to Box with God and you kind of look through it, you realize that, again, she's reaching back to the folk tradition because James Weldon Johnson wrote those sermons, which are often performed as performance pieces, because he wanted to document how Black Southern preachers at that time preached. So that becomes the next piece they work on. And it's very similar to Your Arms Too Short to Box with God, and very antithetical to the golden age of American musicals. So again, there's a story, but the story is based in myth, or for those who might be offended by that, ancient religion. And so there's a general story that everybody knows and can follow, right? If you've grown up in the Western Judeo-Christian
Mhm.
tradition, there's not a lot of stuff on stage. It's ensemble driven. It's about the levels that are on stage, like physical levels on stage, and how actors are, tableau work is really important to me. So
Mhm.
when I see her work, I'm like, oh, it's tableau. It's creating strong visual images that you can then activate,
Right.
and the connection of the visual image plus the way that you're activating the image is actually what creates the piece. So it's actually, if you want to be technical, it's closer to a theatrical happening
Right.
than it is a classic musical, but it's as powerful. And the voices, I mean, it is a celebration of Black gospel
Right. Well,
and the Black church tradition.
I played some of that at the end of my last episode, but once again, let me see if I can play a bit of a clip from that show. This is from the early section, so-called the Beatitudes. It uses, the Book of Matthew, and it
Mhm.
begins with the Sermon on the Mount. But the classic "Blessed are the peacemakers" soon evolves into a much more rousing number. It's an ecstatic experience for the audience right away, and they know that they're now it becomes, there's a Greek word for it which I use in my theater history called methexis, which involves as non-Western forms of theater group participation. The event is shared equally amongst the audience and the performers. It's not just we present this to you, it's we are involved in this together as a community, and this is affecting us all spiritually and emotionally, which is a bit, overwhelming sometimes. And again, we've got disparate reactions from the Philadelphia critics. When this comes down in July of 1975, it comes back down to the Schubert Theater, Philadelphia, which is now no longer just part of the Schubert organization. It's been bought up, the charitable work of a man named Merriam, or a long time it was called the Merriam Theater. And the Daily News poo-poos it again. Ms. Carroll raises a turkey, says Jonathan Takeff in the Philadelphia Daily News. He thinks this is all, she's just rehashing her old stuff. She doesn't like the lyrics. It's, it's exploitation theater of the lowest order. However, William Collins, who was then the main critic for the Inquirer, says it's a new gospel musical, shouts out with joy. He goes all for it. And the Philadelphia Tribune, the black paper, does as well. And I believe the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, which was still publishing back then, also praises it. So, leaving aside the Mr. Takeff in the Daily News, it's generally well received. And again, it goes on to Broadway from Philadelphia. I mean, it was also done in Washington and I think some other places first. But it manages to find an audience in Philadelphia enough to drive it on to New York. And I think a lot of Black people coming to the show, I think what I've seen from the evidence that about 80% of the audience were Black. And I think part of it is your point that we, at the beginning of our interview, where you said the title cues you in, that this is going to be a Black play. If you had heard nothing else, there's a show called Your Arms Too Short with Blacks with God, you would know, oh, that's about me. Oh, I know what that's
Yeah,
going to be.
even if you didn't know the poem,
Right.
the phrasing of it,
Right.
the energy of the language. When you watch the commercial video, because I don't know if they did it in Philly, but in New York, there's it's on my YouTube. When you watch the short, couple seconds promo clip for that musical,
Right.
it looks like a Black gospel revival meeting on stage.
Right.
And there's some clips of when Patti LaBelle in the early 80s, Patti LaBelle came in, I think when it was on tour.
Right.
And she began, I think she was the narrator character.
Yes.
Anytime you get Patti LaBelle on stage, man. And it's like, because it's gospel and it fits. wow, what a great idea. So that's something else that was really powerful. Also, even though it's not the be all end all, this is also the time period in which Vinnette Carroll becomes the first Black woman who not only directs a musical on Broadway, but is nominated for a Tony Award for Best Director. That had never happened in American
Right.
history before. Mickey Grant becomes the first Black woman to be nominated for a score.
Right.
So
And so
not only
having this behind them, and then and there's other shows like The Wiz and others are beginning
The
to,
Wiz is 75. That's
yeah,
absolutely
75,
right. So
bringing
yeah.
Black audiences into Broadway. The producers approach Vinnette Carroll and say, "What do you want to do next? You've actually got something. What can we do next with you?" And she tells them, "Well, I want to do a story based upon Lewis Carroll's, no relation, Alice in Wonderland." Right? And she had been working on this literally since her days back at the New School. I noticed that one of the productions she did there, she played the Red Queen in a production
That's
of Alice in
right.
Wonderland back in the 1940s. And she had also, here's another interesting connection. At one point during the late 1960s, she goes off to Los Angeles to work with something called the Inner City
Yo,
Urban
yeah.
Project, right?
Let me show you something.
Oh, he's leaving his desk. He's coming. He's got one of his
Inner City
LPs.
Cultural Center presents Earthquake. Now, she didn't work on this,
Right,
but the fact that when I heard, because I didn't know that she worked for them.
right. But
So
you know
it makes perfect sense.
who was leading that program? Who it was, and then again, it's a flashback to one of my earlier episodes from last season. Andre Gregory, after he left the Theater of the Living Arts,
Shut
he
up.
he and David Lundy, his managing director, went off to run that program in Los Angeles. And again, they had a terrible falling out with the board of directors. But Vinnette Carroll was one of the people working with them, and she was she was directing The
Wow.
Flies by Jean-Paul Sartre
Wow.
and other projects. So what's the next thing that Andre Gregory leaves that project, goes back, founds his own company called the Manhattan Project in New York, and they develop a show based upon Alice in Wonderland in a very Grotowski-esque way, using his
I didn't know that.
yeah. And at the same time, Vinnette Carroll, I don't know where they had any exchange. I have nothing to back this up. All I'm pointing out is these two major artists. The next project is working on an adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. So Mike Nichols comes on as producers. The Schuberts
Mm-hmm.
give them the Forest Theater in Philadelphia, which at this point they renovated and was now one of their major places for keeping that old out-of-town tryout model alive. They've got their theater, which they built in the 1920s. They've renovated it. They've spruced it up. It looks beautiful. And they're using it as a development center for shows that they figure to go into Broadway. And they have a $1 million budget. They've got who's the star of it's called
Alice.
right, which is key. And who's their star,
Yeah.
Jerrell? What talent do they have there? Who's the
They pick up on a up and coming artist by the name of Debbie Allen,
Debbie Allen, who
plays Alice.
as it turned out, along with her sister Alicia Rashad, right, had been
Yeah.
studying with her at the
At the Urban Art School. So
right.
she literally was training the people
Right.
who would one day step up to take over her, which is the way it's supposed to be. It's really cool.
And she's using the choreographer that she's been working with through all these times, right? It was a multiracial cast. It wasn't an all-black cast, right? But it certainly had. It was Alice in Wonderland from a African American. So they bring it to Philly. It's fully staged. They've got a great set. They've got Taylor Beatty's doing the choreography. It goes terribly. It just dies. Because it doesn't have one of those catchy titles, it's just Alice. The potential Black Philly audience doesn't know that it's a Black play.
Yep.
And nobody shows up to see it.
It doesn't just die. Philadelphia, the critics helped kill it.
Yeah.
Like, everyone who saw this show just decided that they were going to it was like the Ides of March, man.
Everyone's
like, honestly, like everybody pulled out a knife and it was just like, no. And it leans into something, one of the other questions you had coming up, but it just kind of leans into like how America ended up with the British invasion of the 1980s. is a part of that. Alex
Yeah.
is absolutely a part of that.
So they're supposed to be there for 2 months, but after a week, apparently Mike Nichols has banned Vinnette Carroll from the theater. They're going to bring in Tommy Toon to take it over. He's going to direct it. They tell her, look, this project will continue, but you are no longer going to be a part of it.
And she does not go along with that
not
plan.
having it.
That is being African American and being a member of that diaspora and making it in American theater means that while you have an awareness of the things that the way things usually work, you've never been able to dip from the well of the way that things usually work because that well normally doesn't work for you.
Right.
So you do your own thing. So when people come to you like, no, we're taking this, what you mean? No, you're not. Tommy Toon ain't getting his hands on this. This is my art made with my actors. It is my idea. And if you don't want it, you don't want me. We got contracts, don't we? And that's when it becomes this thing of like, it becomes that power struggle. But I appreciate the fact that, because I didn't know that story until I read it in the dissertation.
Yeah.
I appreciate the fact because that's how I operate. When people come to me like, well, we got to have this conversation. I'm like, so I'm taking the play. And people are like, what do you mean? And it's like, this is mine. Well, we thought, I'm sure you did.
Right. So the play closes. Debbie Allen moves on to another project. She finds her career is not going to be okay. But I think it's a lot of the people that had planned to write on this show don't go any further. I don't know whether she had a falling out with Mickey Grant because she recreates it. She calls it But Never Jam Today. But then it's got a new composer. It's got a new choreographer. I don't know whether because of the contracts that they had signed with the first group that they were unable to do it. She had to completely remake it in order. And it goes to the Longacre Theater in New York. It doesn't come through Philly. But it fails again. It doesn't get
it does. It's a double whammy. But no, Vinnette Carroll goes and does her own thing on Never Jam Today. And again, sometimes they can't be. Sometimes it just doesn't work.
Right.
But when you look at how many flops did George Abbott have? I mean, how many flops did Hal Prince have? It's about the industry inviting you back.
Right.
And for people like Hal Prince, George Abbott, Bob Fosse, the white men, they were more or less invited back. And we can talk about temperament, but Vinnette Carroll was known to have the temperament of an auteur.
Right.
This is my vision, this is my idea, and you are executing that idea and vision, and that's all I need from you.
Right. Well, she does have, she continues to perform in some ways. I'm going to share now a clip. I realized when I was researching this that, I know who Vinnette Carroll was.
There
she was the doctor in All in the Family.
That's right.
In 1976, she gets recruited to play a Jamaican doctor who's operating on Archie Bunker, played by Carol O'Connor, no relation. He's about to get a hernia operation, I think. And he's startled. Of course, famously, Carol O'Connor's a lovely man, but he's playing a character who's deeply racist. And that's the joke of the show. And he's in the hospital, lying in bed in his hospital gown, and in walks this Black woman with a cart. And I'll just play a bit of the clip from the TV show All in the Family.
Now, wait a minute. I want to tell you something. Whatever you're going to do here, I don't care what it is, I want you to explain it to me.
Now, you listen, Boise. If you behave yourself, I'll be good to you. But if you don't behave yourself, I'll go and take a bedpan and beat you with it.
Well, wait a minute. Shouldn't we wait for the doctor, huh?
I am a doctor. I am on the staff here.
Oh, you're a regular doctor?
Only at night. By day, I strangle chickens for the colonel.
And it gets the applause that you might expect. So, but she is continuing she loses the space that she's been working at with the Urban Arts Theater. She finds another space to keep doing her work, and she comes back to Philadelphia with another show. But now she's getting into her early 60s, I believe, by this point. But she's still working, and she's got another show called When Hell Freezes Over, I'll Skate.
I'm very familiar with the film. I have it. I watch it all the time.
Yeah, because there is a recording. Eventually, it was done at the Lincoln Center, and and then it was recorded for PBS, and they brought it down to an hour. But before that happened, it came down to the Forest Theater in Philadelphia. And here's what happened. Vinnette Carroll had hoped to follow up on the success she's had with such hits as Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope, and Your Arm Too Short to Box with God. Nonetheless, in an interview, Carroll admitted she was terrified about coming to Philadelphia with a new project because Alice had died in Philadelphia just 6 years previously when it was met with savage reviews. That was the most devastating experience I've had in the theater, she admitted in an interview with the Daily News' Nels Nelson. For a long time after that, I was absolutely immobilized. What went wrong? I really don't know. We got to Philadelphia and it didn't work. The punches were so great that we didn't feel we could get up. In fact, I thought I wasn't going to come back to Philadelphia again. It's so funny. We're coming back to Philadelphia, to the same theater that we played Alice in. So we've matured a lot, or we're terribly masochistic. When I was young, I was very cocky about this whole business. It all seemed crystal clear. I think that the older one gets and the more one works in the vineyard, the more humble one gets. You see more of the canvas, I guess, but you hope you're communicating and you hope that you reach a wide audience and that they can feel some of the things that you feel. I want them to leave the theater saying, that's how it was for me. To that extent, I'll be pleased. It's a crazy business we're in. I hope this one works, she says. It did to an extent, but it certainly wasn't the success of her earlier shows. And what does the last part of her career like, Jerrell? She doesn't stay in New York, right?
I know that she ends up in Florida.
Right.
And I believe she opened up, it's like the Vinnette Carroll School for the Arts or something.
Yeah.
In Florida.
Fort
And
Lauderdale.
that's kind of the last that I know of her. Because to be really honest, I didn't really begin to learn about who she was until after she had passed away.
She dies in 2002. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So at the age of 80. But she spends her years of essential retirement in Florida, but still working as a theater artist to the very end. Yeah. What can we say in terms of, does she get overlooked? Does she get passed by? Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. I have a really bad habit of answering questions before they're finished.
No, but you saw where I was going, so of course you jumped in. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. The short answer is yes. It's one of the reasons why anytime I can talk about her, I talk about her. She was a pioneer in American theater, not just Black theater, American theater. Are you kidding me? She did the impossible at a time where there was more pushing against her than there is now. What happens to her is what happens to a lot of African Americans, particularly once their era of being celebrated has kind of passed on. People just kind of move on and forget about you. But a lot of the artists who are creating art either before, during, or after her get remembered, but they're primarily men. Lloyd Richards is still talked about, but he was a Black man. He made it to, like Yale and the O'Neill. And that's one of the reasons why he's still talked about. But a lot of the other artists who were working at that time who were also creating dynamic work, and I'm talking writing, acting, producing, directing. I'm talking about Ozzie Davis. I'm talking about Donald McHale. I'm talking about Ruby Dee. I'm talking about even Belafonte. You know what I mean? A lot of these folks had projects they were producing, but you don't hear about them because they just didn't get a lot of love. And in the 90s, once the American theater becomes, once we have that conversation of what happened to the American theater, that's when you begin to see folks like Billy Porter, Audrey McDonald, Brian Stokes Mitchell, LaShawn. That's when that generation begins to come up. But the musicals that they're in, even when they're Black, even when they're musicals about Black life, are often written by white people. So I love Marie Christine. That's one of my favorite musicals of all time. But it's only a Black musical because of what it's about and who's in it. You know what I mean? It's not the same kind of creation. It's interesting to me that when I read, especially this dissertation has really been a dream come true, Peter. So thank you for sharing that with me. When I read about the work that she created and how she created it, and I realized that without Vinnette Carroll, Julie Taymor would have had a harder time. Mary Zimmerman would have had a harder time because these are other women that would make it to Broadway a generation or two later. A woman doesn't win the Tony until 1997 when Julie Taymor wins for The Lion King. And Julie Taymor's work in terms of getting out of the Aristotelian storytelling and going back to the epic, the myth, it's not a lot of it's a lot of candy. It's a lot of money on that stage,
Right.
but you're not seeing giant sets. You're not. It's not My Fair Lady. That's not what this is.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's closer. It's closer to the primal theatrical. When you talk about those two women who are also essential, Mary Zimmerman was a teacher of mine. She means her learning from her means a great deal to me. But now that I'm learning about what Vinnette Carroll did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I'm
Mhm.
like, they need to be like giving it up to Vinnette because
Right.
she did it first. And she was a Black woman who did it. You know what I mean? Like when you look at like the actual inspiration and how she's actually able to move the ball forward, it's similar to like Paul Robeson. The fact that no one talks about Paul Robeson now, and he was one of the most essential one of the most essential people in the world. He
Right.
was a global personality almost 100 years before social media.
We
Okay.
have on this podcast is all
So
we
anyway,
have.
all of that to say,
Right.
her legacy gets swept under the rug like
Right.
Hidden Figures. And so it takes people like us to continue talking about it
Right.
and bringing it up so that people can be like, oh, yeah, that's right. Oh,
Right.
yeah, that's right.
Frankly, if she had the capital resources,
That
one
he
of the
was
things that
able
she
to
was
use
never
it.
able to do, apparently, at the Urban Arts Center was to establish a long-term endowment that she could she was often just bailed out by Richard Rogers. God bless him. Richard Rogers
Really?
and his wife. She would turn to
Wow. Did
Richard
not know that.
Rogers and he would back her projects
Wow.
many times. Now he would get a theater for her. So
That's dope.
and of course, when he passed away, then she didn't have that particular back anymore. But the Rogers family was essential to helping her out. But she was never able to establish the same. I mean, he had over the course of his career and his wife's career established a huge fund of capital. But Vinnette Carroll wasn't sitting on that kind of stuff, right? So,
Exactly. And so
which
she
is
just didn't
often
have the opportunity.
the fate
So
of African American institutions. Well, Jerrell, as we come to round things up here, can you tell us more about your ongoing and upcoming projects? Here's your chance to plug away. Having dropped a lot of knowledge on us, tell us where you're going next.
Black Theater Vinyl Archive, which celebrates, is my personal collection of vinyl albums that celebrates the contributions of members of the African diaspora in theater and musical theater history. And that's a wide variety. One of the things that, we even having this conversation, it's really hard to have hard and fast rules when it comes to collecting Black theater and Black history in general, just because it's so thrown out to the universe.
Mhm.
You just kind of find it. But anyway, I'm in the 4th season of Black Theater Vinyl Archive. I said I would do 5. So this season will wrap up at the sometime in September, and then the last official season will start up next March. I do spring to fall, and then I'm currently developing a podcast with Black Theater Nerd from Instagram, Courtney Murray Gary.
Oh, yes.
We're gonna do a podcast based
Shout out to
on
Courtney.
Courtney she's an amazing artist, and
Okay.
I tell you, that's why it's important to work with people who are younger than you because they have
Sure.
energy. Like, the football has been pulled away. Anyway, we're gonna do a podcast series based on the vinyl archive.
Okay.
So that's kind of the next step. And I'm
Wonderful.
directing Fat Ham in January if you're in Virginia.
Are you what? You
Yeah,
are?
co-production with Virginia Stage Company and Virginia Rep, and that'll start in January. So
Fantastic.
talk about
Philadelphia's
Philly.
own James Imes.
That's right.
And who you've directed his work before, but you're now continuing to work with that project, which I'm very, very fond of. That's wonderful. Well, congratulations on that. And thank you, Jerrell, for coming along with us and for telling us so much and allowing me to share what I found out. And thanks to Dr. McClinton, Calvin McClinton, whose work we very much depended on, as well as a interview that we discovered in the works by Lofton Mitchell in Voices of the Black Theater, which was published back in the early 1970s, and other stuff that I've been able to uncover from the newspaper archives. But Jerrell, thank you for being a friend of the podcast. Thank you for once again allowing me to do an interview format. Most of season 4 of this podcast is going to be interviews like this. So I'm glad to be able to get back in the saddle on conducting these and learning how to do it again. So we'll say thank you and goodbye to Jerrell. And for our listeners, there'll be one more small coda episode of season 3, where we talk about the end of the tryout town era in Philadelphia theater. So I'll be back in a week or so with that small coda, in which I will read a chapter from my upcoming book, Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia.
Thank you.